3,000 years ago, a single idea cut reality in half, and the wound never healed. Why did ancient humans suddenly begin to see the world as a battlefield instead of a living whole? Why were gods forced into rigid camps of light and darkness? Why did inner voices become enemies and balance turn into sin? Why do civilizations across continents echo the same fear-driven symbols as if following one script? And why does this division still harvest conflict, devotion, and despair today? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. Forget everything you were taught about angels as gentle guardians floating above humanity with soft wings and human smiles. That image is a late invention, a cosmetic mask layered over something far older and far more unsettling. If you step backward through time, past Renaissance paintings and cathedral ceilings, past hymns and Sunday sermons, you arrive in a world where the word angel did not bring comfort. It triggered paralysis, collapse, silence. In the earliest accounts, people did not feel protected in their presence. They felt physically overwhelmed, as if standing too close to a storm that burned the air itself. Ancient witnesses describe encounters that sound less like religious visions and more like system failures inside the human body. Knees buckled, voices disappeared, minds fractured under sensory overload. These reactions were not poetic exaggerations, they were consistent. The first words spoken by these beings were never blessings, they were commands. "Do not be afraid" was not reassurance. It was an emergency instruction, the equivalent of telling a nervous system on the brink of shutdown to stabilize before total collapse. You say that only when fear is already absolute. The oldest texts do not describe humanoid messengers. They struggle to describe something that refuses to fit into familiar categories. Shapes rotate instead of walking. Motion occurs without friction or direction. There are structures within structures, wheels intersecting wheels, surfaces covered in eyes that are not eyes, but points of perception, like sensors embedded across a machine. Faces are not expressions, but functions, merged and rotating, never settling into one orientation long enough to be understood. Light radiates not as warmth, but as intensity, the glare of overheated metal pulled from a forge. To modern eyes, these descriptions feel disturbingly technical. Movement like lightning is not metaphorical grace, it is sudden displacement. Fire that does not consume, but illuminates suggests energy release rather than flame. Sound described as rushing water or a massive army is not music, it is vibration, pressure, force. These beings do not arrive, they activate, they do not speak, they transmit. This is why early prophets collapse. The human brain evolved to interpret faces, voices, and gestures. Confronted with something that bypasses those systems entirely, cognition breaks down. Fear is not moral in this context. It is biological. When confronted with something too foreign to categorize, the body reacts as if facing annihilation. Over time, these accounts were buried, not erased, but softened. Their sharp edges were dulled. By the time religious institutions gained centralized power, these descriptions were dangerous. A population that understands its overseers as incomprehensible, mechanical, and utterly indifferent does not worship easily. So the imagery changed. Wings became feathers instead of fields of force. Eyes vanished. Wheels were forgotten. Faces became symmetrical and human. The terrifying became relatable. This was not artistic evolution. It was strategic rebranding. Once angels looked human, they became negotiable. Once they smiled, they could be trusted. Once they resembled us, hierarchy felt natural. The unknown had to be made familiar because fear that cannot be directed becomes uncontrollable. And uncontrollable fear does not build institutions. It destroys them. But fragments of the older truth survived, hidden in untranslated words and awkward phrases that resist revision. One of those words is often rendered as seraph. It is commonly imagined as a higher class of angel, closer to the divine, purer, brighter. Yet its original meaning is far more revealing. The root implies burning, not warmth, but combustion. More disturbingly, it also implies serpentine motion, something elongated, coiling, alive with energy. A burning serpent is not a poetic guardian. It is a luminous threat. Descriptions of encounters with these beings read like exposure reports. Eyes ache, skin prickles, time distorts. Prolonged presence is unbearable. People shield their faces not out of humility but pain. This is not worshipful awe. It is survival instinct reacting to an environment suddenly flooded with overwhelming stimulus. And then there is the pattern of destruction. When ancient texts describe entire armies dying overnight without wounds, without blood, without visible violence, they frame it as divine intervention. But remove the theological lens, and the event changes shape. Lives extinguished simultaneously, bodies intact, no struggle. This resembles neither sword nor plague. It resembles deactivation, like systems switched off rather than destroyed. The implication is uncomfortable. If these beings were capable of such precision, such scale, and such detachment, then their relationship to humanity was never parental. It was administrative. Oversight rather than care, control rather than guidance, which raises an even more disturbing question. If angels were never gentle, never truly benevolent in the way later traditions insist, then who decided they should be portrayed that way? And more importantly, why? The answer lies in what happens when humans believe their overseers are terrifying and inhuman. They do not internalize obedience. They comply only when watched. But when overseers are framed as loving, forgiving, and morally aligned with human ideals, control becomes internal. People police themselves. Fear is replaced with guilt. Surveillance becomes conscience. This transformation required a complete inversion of imagery. The many-eyed wheels had to disappear. The burning serpents had to become chubby infants with wings. Terror had to become comfort. The unknown had to be rendered safe enough to adore. And yet traces remain. In the lingering unease people feel when they truly read the oldest descriptions instead of the sanitized versions. In the instinctive discomfort triggered by phrases that feel out of place in religious narratives, like they moved without turning, or their appearance was like fire enclosed. These are not spiritual metaphors. They are failed attempts to describe systems beyond the language of their time. Once you accept this, a new pattern emerges. The so-called war between heaven and hell begins to look less like a moral conflict and more like a functional one. If angels are not moral guardians but operators, then their enemies are unlikely to be chaotic monsters. They would be rivals within the same system, performing opposing roles. Light and darkness stop being ethical absolutes and start resembling interface states, different modes of interaction designed to extract different responses. Hope from one side, fear from the other, both equally effective. And suddenly, the question shifts. Not who is good and who is evil, but who benefits from keeping humanity trapped between these two extremes. Because if both forces require emotional output to function, then humanity is not the audience. It is the generator. The true horror is not that angels were terrifying. It is that they were efficient. And efficiency has never cared about innocence. Once that realization settles in, the familiar moral universe cracks. The comforting story of protection dissolves, replaced by something colder and far more systematic. And if the beings of light were never what we thought they were, then the nature of their supposed enemies demands a closer look, stripped of inherited fear and theological distortion. Because the moment angels lose their halos, demons stop looking like monsters and start looking like something else entirely. There was a time when the word demon did not provoke fear. It did not conjure images of claws, fire, or moral corruption. In its earliest usage, it pointed inward, not downward. It named something intimate and personal, a presence that did not attack from the shadows, but whispered from within. Long before demons were imagined as enemies of humanity, they were understood as companions of consciousness. In ancient Greece, this presence was called the daemon. It was not a creature with a body or a face. It was a force, a guiding signal, like an internal compass calibrated at birth. Every person was believed to receive one, not as a reward or punishment, but as a natural condition of being human. Your daemon shaped your temperament, your instincts, your inclinations. It did not command you to act. It intervened only to stop you from acting against your deeper alignment. This idea survives most clearly in the life of Socrates. He openly spoke of his daemonion, an inner voice that never told him what to do, only what not to do. It warned him away from false paths, from decisions that would fracture his integrity. For his contemporaries, this was not madness or heresy. It was a recognized phenomenon. To be guided by a daemon was to be attuned, not possessed. In that world, inspiration and madness were neighbors. Poets, artists, and philosophers were said to be touched by their daemons when creativity overtook them. Ecstasy did not mean loss of self. It meant alignment with something deeper than deliberate thought. No rigid boundary separated the rational from the inspired. Both were considered necessary. This worldview contained no absolute evil. Forces could be dangerous, overwhelming, or destructive, but they were not morally opposed to humanity. They were part of the same living system. Storms killed, but storms were not wicked. Fire destroyed, but fire also transformed. The cosmos was not divided into camps. It was a spectrum. That balance did not survive translation. When Jewish scholars in Alexandria undertook the monumental task of translating Hebrew sacred texts into Greek, they faced a problem that was not linguistic, but ideological. The Greek language carried concepts that did not fit comfortably inside an emerging monotheistic framework. The daimon was one of them. The Hebrew texts contained references to various spirits of the wilderness, night, illness, and chaos. These were not unified under a single category. They were situational forces, dangerous but specific. The translators, working under pressure to produce coherence, made a decision that would echo for millennia. They collapsed these diverse entities, along with the Greek daimon, into a single term. Daimon became daimonion. Daimonion became demon. In one stroke, an inner guide became an external threat. This was not a mistranslation. It was a reframing. Once the daimon was labeled as hostile, the human interior became suspect. Inner voices were no longer sources of wisdom. They were potential intrusions. Inspiration became temptation. Intuition became danger. The consequences were profound. If the divine no longer spoke through the individual, it had to speak through institutions. Authority shifted outward. Priests replaced personal insight. Doctrine replaced discernment. The safest spiritual posture became obedience. Fear was an efficient tool for enforcing this shift. If your inner impulses could be demonic, then trusting yourself was reckless. Salvation required external validation. Rituals, intermediaries, and hierarchies were no longer optional. They were necessary defenses against yourself. This is when possession narratives emerge, not as descriptions of rare psychological crises, but as cultural mechanisms. Behavior that deviated from accepted norms could now be attributed to demonic influence. Responsibility moved away from systems and onto individuals. Control became moralized. And yet, the older understanding never fully disappeared. It survived in fragments, particularly in cultures that resisted strict dualism. In Mesopotamia, beings that modern readers label as demons occupied ambiguous roles. They brought disease and drought, but they also protected against greater threats. Amulets were worn not to banish them entirely, but to negotiate with them. One such figure was Pazuzu, whose composite form appears monstrous by modern standards. To ancient people, that form signaled function. Lion features meant strength. Eagle wings meant reach. A scorpion tail meant lethality. Pazuzu was feared, but he was also invoked as protection against a more destructive force. Evil was contextual, not absolute. These entities were not rebels against a supreme good. They were components in a system that maintained equilibrium through tension. Remove one, and imbalance followed. The idea that all non-sanctioned forces were enemies required a new narrative. That narrative was provided by dualism, the belief that reality is structured around an eternal conflict between opposing moral absolutes. This framework did not arise organically across cultures. It entered history at a specific moment, in a specific place, carrying the authority of revelation. Once dualism took hold, ambiguity became intolerable. Neutral forces had to be classified. Internal guidance had to be distrusted. The daemon could no longer be a teacher. It had to be a deceiver. This reclassification did more than alter theology. It reshaped psychology. Humans were taught to experience their own impulses as suspect, their instincts as dangerous, their creativity as something that required supervision. The inner world became a battleground rather than a resource. Over time, the demon was pushed further outward, from inner voice to external entity, from subtle influence to horned caricature. By the Middle Ages, demons had bodies, names, ranks, and offices. They became administrators of punishment, enforcers of cosmic law. Their terrifying forms mirrored the rigid structures of emerging states and churches. Yet even in these later texts, something curious persists. Demons are organized. They follow rules. They operate within hierarchies. They negotiate contracts. This is not the behavior of chaotic forces. It is the behavior of officials, which suggests that the demon was never meant to represent disorder. It represented the unacceptable aspects of order. those parts of the system that could not be openly acknowledged but were necessary for control. By externalizing the daemon and labeling it evil, humanity lost access to a critical layer of self-regulation. Inner conflict was no longer a source of insight. It became a sign of corruption. And when people are taught to fear their own depth, they become easier to manage. The true transformation, then, was not spiritual. It was political. By redefining the internal guide as an enemy, power shifted permanently outward. The human being was split against itself. Once that split occurred, the stage was set. Angels could become symbols of authority. Demons could become symbols of rebellion. And the individual, caught between them, could be harvested through fear and hope in equal measure. What was lost was not innocence, but autonomy. And if the demon was once your guide, your warning system, your inner restraint, then its demonization was not an accident. It was a calculated removal of a safeguard. Because a human who listens inward is difficult to rule. For most of human history, the world was not divided. It was dangerous, unpredictable, and alive, but it was whole. Gods could create and destroy in the same gesture. Storms nourished crops and erased villages. Death was not an enemy of life. It was one of its movements. Moral absolutes did not exist because nature itself did not obey them. This way of seeing reality persisted across continents until a rupture occurred, not gradually, but decisively. That rupture began on the dry plateaus of ancient Iran, where a priest named Zarathustra introduced an idea so radical that it rewired the spiritual operating system of humanity. He claimed that existence itself was structured around a cosmic opposition between two principles that could never be reconciled. One represented truth, order, and light. The other embodied deception, chaos, and darkness. For the first time, reality was framed as a war. This was not merely a theological claim, it was a psychological one. Every thought, every action, every breath became a contribution to one side or the other. Neutrality vanished. Balance became betrayal. To exist was to choose constantly under invisible surveillance. Before this moment, divine forces were complex. They could be cruel and generous, inspiring and destructive, often simultaneously. Afterward, complexity became intolerable. The world was flattened into moral polarity. Good and evil were no longer perspectives. They were camps. Zarathustra's vision centered on a supreme intelligence associated with wisdom and clarity, opposed by an equally potent force of corruption and disorder. This was not a minor mythological adjustment. It was the first full articulation of ethical dualism, the belief that the universe itself is divided into morally opposed factions locked in eternal struggle. What makes this shift extraordinary is its asymmetry. The opposing forces are described as nearly equal in power. This raises a troubling question. Why would a supreme intelligence require an adversary of comparable strength? In earlier traditions, chaos existed, but it was not personified as a rival. It was a condition, not an enemy. Dualism changed that. Conflict was no longer accidental. It became necessary. From a systems perspective, this makes sense. Conflict generates energy. Fear sharpens attention. Loyalty intensifies identity. A population that believes it is under constant existential threat will regulate itself far more efficiently than one that sees the world as ambiguous. Once this framework emerged, it spread rapidly. When the Persian Empire expanded, it carried these ideas with it. During the Babylonian captivity, Jewish scribes encountered dualistic concepts that did not previously exist in their theology. Before this influence, there was no cosmic rebel opposing the Creator. There was an accuser, a functionary, a prosecutor within the divine court, not an enemy. Afterward, that figure transformed. The accuser became an antagonist. Evil gained a face, a will, and a mission. Heaven acquired ranks. Hell took shape. Angels and demons became opposing armies rather than components of a single administration. This was not coincidence. It was integration. The new framework solved several problems simultaneously. It explained suffering without implicating the supreme authority. It justified obedience as moral necessity. It transformed dissent into treason against cosmic order. Most importantly, it externalized blame. If something went wrong, it was the work of the enemy. From that point forward, religion became inseparable from alignment. You were no longer simply living well or poorly. You were fighting, whether you knew it or not. Every ritual, every law, every moral code became a weapon. This worldview proved extraordinarily durable. It fused easily with emerging state power. Kings ruled by divine mandate. Wars were framed as holy. Violence acquired purpose. Suffering acquired meaning, and meaning, once assigned, could be harvested. What often goes unnoticed is how closely this dualistic model resembles modern systems theory. Two opposing forces locked in dynamic equilibrium, each sustaining the other through perpetual tension. Remove one, and the system collapses. Conflict is not a flaw. It is the engine. This reframes the figure of the adversary entirely. Rather than a rogue force corrupting creation, the adversary becomes a functional necessity. Without an enemy, there is no war. Without war, there is no moral urgency. Without urgency, there is no control. This is why the adversary is never destroyed. In every version of the story, its defeat is postponed, deferred to an undefined future. The war must continue. The harvest depends on it. Dualism also introduced a profound fracture in human consciousness. Internal conflict, once understood as natural tension, became evidence of moral failure. Doubt became weakness. Ambivalence became guilt. The inner world was colonized by surveillance. You were no longer simply afraid. You were afraid of being afraid. You were no longer angry. You were angry at your anger. The self split into observer and suspect. This internal division mirrors the cosmic one perfectly. Once internal unity was broken, external unity followed. Communities divided along ideological lines. Heresy became a crime. Difference became danger. History since that moment can be read as a series of variations on the same theme. Us versus them, light versus dark, chosen versus fallen. What makes this especially unsettling is how artificial the division appears when examined closely. Earlier cultures thrived without it. Moral behavior existed without cosmic enemies. Responsibility did not require absolute opposition. Dualism did not elevate humanity. It polarized it. And polarization is addictive. It simplifies decision-making. It relieves individuals of nuance. It offers identity without introspection. All of this comes at a cost, but the cost is paid slowly, across generations. By the time these ideas reached later religious systems, they were no longer recognized as innovations. They felt eternal, obvious, necessary. The war had always been there, people assumed. It had simply been revealed. But history tells a different story. The split has a beginning, and anything with a beginning can be examined. Once you see dualism not as truth, but as architecture, a design choice rather than a revelation, everything else shifts. Angels and demons stop being moral absolutes. They become instruments. Light and darkness stop being enemies. They become modes. And humanity, caught between them, stops being the prize of the war. It becomes the fuel. Once the world was split, it needed managers. A system built on eternal conflict cannot function on abstraction alone. It requires structure, hierarchy, and enforcement. This is where the figure of the rebel enters the narrative, not as an accident, but as a necessity. The being later called Lucifer did not emerge as a monster. He emerged as an administrator. In the oldest layers of the story, his name does not signify evil. It means bearer of light, a title that describes function rather than character. Light, in physical terms, is information. To carry light is to carry knowledge, visibility, awareness. This role places the figure not at the margins of the system, but at its core. He is not a trespasser. He is infrastructure. Descriptions portray him as a covering cherub, a guardian positioned at the center of operations. This is not a poet's exaggeration. In symbolic language, to cover is to stabilize, to ensure continuity, to prevent collapse. He is depicted as adorned with precision, stones arranged like circuitry, reflecting ordered complexity. This is the imagery of design, not chaos. The rebellion narrative claims that pride drove him to seek equality with the supreme authority. Taken literally, this makes little sense. A being with intimate knowledge of the system's architecture would understand its limits better than anyone. The motive does not align with the intelligence attributed to him. A different interpretation emerges when the rebellion is viewed as a controlled fracture. Systems do not evolve through stasis. They evolve through tension. Introducing an internal opposition allows for dynamic adjustment. Without resistance, there is no feedback. Without feedback, there is no optimization. In this light, the fall becomes a deployment. The event is described across cultures with striking consistency. A sudden rupture in the sky, a star falling, the ground shaking, the air burning. These are not moral symbols. They are physical descriptions of energy release, displacement, impact. For ancient observers, this was divine drama. For modern eyes, it resembles catastrophic system failure or deliberate expulsion. Those who fell did not dissolve. They relocated. They retained structure, hierarchy, and capability. This alone undermines the idea of total defeat. If the supreme authority wished to eliminate them, erasure would be trivial. Instead, they were confined to a lower operational domain. This domain later became known as hell, not as a place of random torment, but as a zone of containment. Frequency matters here. Lower does not mean inferior, it means denser, slower, more constrained. A realm closer to matter, closer to biology, closer to human perception. This placement makes strategic sense. If humanity is the resource, the processing infrastructure must be close to it. The most revealing detail appears in later texts where the adversary is not an exile but a participant. He appears in councils, engages in negotiations, proposes tests. This is not the behavior of an enemy. It is the behavior of a colleague with a specialized function. The role he plays is consistently destructive, but never arbitrary. He accuses, tests, destabilizes. In modern terms, he performs stress testing. He exposes weaknesses. He provokes failure to reveal integrity. Without him, the system lacks contrast. This reframes suffering. Pain is not punishment, it is calibration. Loss is not chaos, it is data. The moral framing hides this functionality. By casting the adversary as evil, the system absolves itself of responsibility. Every flaw can be blamed on the rebel. Every tragedy becomes sabotage rather than design. This misdirection is essential. A system that reveals its true mechanics risks rejection. From this perspective, free will takes on a darker shape. Choice exists, but within boundaries designed to maximize output. Fear and hope become the primary levers. Angels reinforce compliance through promise. Demons enforce it through threat. Both push behavior toward predictability. The rebel's tragedy, if there is one, lies in awareness. To carry light is to see the system clearly. To see it clearly is to recognize its cost. If humanity is being used, then facilitating that process, even in opposition, becomes ethically ambiguous. This opens the possibility that the rebellion was not an act of pride, but of dissent. Not against authority, but against policy. A refusal to accept humanity as mere resource. If so, the fall was inevitable. Systems do not tolerate internal critique. They absorb it or expel it. Expulsion preserves stability. Once removed, the dissenter becomes the perfect scapegoat. All cruelty can be attributed to him. All injustice can be justified as defense against his influence. His image can be twisted into whatever form best serves control. Over time, this image hardens. Horns, fire, grotesque features. These are not descriptions. They are warnings. They teach fear reflexively, bypassing analysis. The adversary must never appear sympathetic, because sympathy invites questions. Yet beneath the caricature, the structure remains. Hell is not disorder. It is organization pushed to its most merciless extreme. Layers, ranks, jurisdictions, each spirit assigned a domain, each action accounted for. This mirrors the heavenly hierarchy exactly, like a negative image. The similarity is not coincidence, it is efficiency. Two departments operating under the same corporate logic, optimized for different emotional outputs. Hope generates devotion. Fear generates compliance. Both generate energy. The rebel's role is to make the system believable. Without an enemy, authority appears arbitrary. With an enemy, authority appears necessary. The greater the threat, the more extreme the measures that can be justified. This dynamic persists today, long after the mythic language has faded. Political systems, economic models, and social structures all rely on constructed adversaries to maintain cohesion. The pattern is ancient because it works. If the rebel never truly rebelled, but fulfilled a role written into the system's foundation, then the entire narrative of cosmic war collapses. What remains is management. And humanity, positioned between promise and punishment, continues to produce exactly what the system requires. Not salvation, sustainability. If heaven was the face of order and hell the mechanism of enforcement, then the true genius of the system lay not in its theology, but in its paperwork. Chaos is inefficient. Terror without structure burns itself out. What endured for centuries was not fear alone, but organized fear, fear processed, categorized, documented, and deployed with precision. This is where the image of hell as a screaming abyss fails completely. The sources tell a colder story. Medieval demonological texts do not describe madness, they describe administration. Names are listed, titles are assigned, jurisdictions are defined. Authority flows downward through ranks that mirror secular governments of the time with unsettling accuracy. Kings command princes. Princes command dukes. Dukes command legions. Each office has a function. Each function has limits. This is not how humans imagine evil instinctively. It is how humans imagine bureaucracy. One of the most revealing documents in this tradition is often mischaracterized as a spellbook. In reality, it reads more like a manual for interacting with a regulatory agency. Precise procedures must be followed. Incorrect symbols invalidate results. Improper timing leads to consequences. Authority does not come from force, but from protocol. Demons do not break rules, they exploit them. This obsession with legality is the key to understanding the system. Power here does not operate through raw domination. It operates through consent, even if that consent is coerced, manipulated, or extracted under duress. Contracts matter because they formalize agreement. Agreement transfers responsibility. When a human signs, speaks, or symbolically acknowledges a pact, the system records compliance. What follows is no longer theft. It is transaction. This is why demons bargain. A being that can simply take would never negotiate. Negotiation implies constraint. Constraint implies oversight. Oversight implies a system larger than the individual entities within it. The demonological hierarchy is often dismissed as projection, humans imposing familiar structures onto the unknown. But projection does not explain consistency across centuries and cultures, nor does it explain why the hierarchy aligns so perfectly with mechanisms of social control that emerged later. This suggests that the infernal bureaucracy was not imagined. It was observed. Each demon's assigned domain reveals the system's priorities. Some govern deception, others desire, others despair, others sudden catastrophe. These are not random vices. They are pressure points. Exploit them effectively, and behavior becomes predictable. Fear of punishment alone produces resistance. Fear combined with inevitability produces submission. Bureaucracy excels at inevitability. Hell, in this framework, is not a pit. It is a processing plant. Input arrives as human emotion, particularly fear, guilt, and desperation. Output is compliance, conformity, and energy redirected upward through the hierarchy. The most disturbing implication is how closely this structure mirrors religious institutions that claim to oppose it. Heaven and hell share organizational DNA. The difference lies only in branding. One promises reward, the other threatens consequence. Both require obedience. This is why the demonological texts obsess over seals, signatures, and exact language. These are not superstitions. They are interfaces. Symbols act as access keys. Words function as commands. Geometry stabilizes intention. The system responds not to belief, but to correct input. This explains why mistakes are punished so harshly, not morally, but mechanically. An error is not sin. It is malfunction. Humans engaging this system believed they were controlling demons. In reality, they were interacting with a compliance framework far older and more sophisticated than themselves. The illusion of control was part of the design. Participation deepened dependency. The figure of Solomon illustrates this perfectly. He is not remembered as a warrior who defeated demons, but as an administrator who catalogued them. He named them. He assigned them tasks. He bound them through seals rather than violence. Cataloging is power. Naming is classification. Classification enables management, but management always extracts a cost. Solomon's kingdom, legendary for its wisdom, collapses immediately after his death. This is not coincidence. Systems that grant power without understanding always reclaim balance. The demons were never trapped forever. They were temporarily redirected. When the containment failed, they did not escape into chaos. They returned to function. This reinforces a critical insight. These entities are not invaders. They are native to the system. Their operations predate humanity. Humanity merely learned how to interface with them. The bureaucracy of hell exists because it must. A system harvesting emotional output at scale cannot rely on improvisation. It requires predictability. Documentation ensures continuity. Hierarchy ensures accountability. And accountability ensures that no part of the system questions the system itself. This is where the true horror resides, not in fire or torment, but in paperwork that never expires. Contracts without termination clauses, agreements enforced across lifetimes, responsibility shifted permanently onto the individual. Once a human internalizes this logic, control becomes self-sustaining. You do not need guards when people monitor themselves. You do not need chains when guilt is sufficient. The infernal bureaucracy did not create fear. It optimized it. And optimization is never accidental. By the time these structures were fully articulated, humanity was already embedded within them. Religion, law, morality, and governance had merged into a single operating system. Angels managed aspiration. Demons managed deviation. Both reported upward. What remained invisible was the architecture itself, because systems function best when their users believe they are free. If the infernal bureaucracy represented the machinery of control, then there had to be a manual, a point where human hands touched the levers directly. That manual was never meant for the masses. It circulated quietly, copied by candlelight, guarded by those who believed knowledge itself was a weapon. What survived into history under the name of the Lesser Key was not a book of superstition. It was an interface guide. Its structure alone reveals its true nature. 72 entities, each assigned a precise rank, each described with a function rather than a personality. They do not behave like mythological creatures. They behave like specialized modules. One retrieves information, another influences crowds, another manipulates perception, memory, or desire. This is not storytelling. This is cataloging. In modern terms, it resembles an index of subroutines. The most unsettling aspect is not what these entities can do, but how they are accessed. The process does not rely on faith. Belief is irrelevant. What matters is accuracy. Timing, geometry, language, and sequence must align. The practitioner is not praying. He is executing a procedure. This alone should dismantle the notion that these traditions emerged from ignorance. Ignorant people do not invent systems that punish minor deviations with catastrophic precision. Ignorant people do not preserve protocols across centuries with such consistency. The seals associated with each entity are not artistic flourishes. They are diagrams, closed circuits, loops, intersections. When viewed without mystical bias, they resemble control schematics. Lines intersect where flows converge. Shapes lock intention into form. The seal is not symbolic. It is functional. The name spoken during invocation is not a label. It is a frequency. Ancient languages were not poetic by accident. Their sounds were shaped by breath, throat, and resonance. When pronounced correctly, they vibrate the body itself. The human nervous system becomes part of the circuit. This is why the texts obsess over pronunciation. A single altered sound breaks the link. The system does not respond to intent alone. It responds to precision. Those who compiled these manuals understood something fundamental. Power does not require domination if access is granted voluntarily. The ritual creates the illusion of mastery, but it is the human who steps into the system, not the other way around. The figure of Solomon stands at the center of this tradition not as a magician, but as an engineer. His legendary ring is described not as a source of raw power, but as a seal, a signet, a key. Keys do not generate authority, they authenticate it. The ring did not command demons because Solomon was wise. It commanded them because it matched the system's requirements for access. Authority was never personal. It was procedural. This explains the paradox of Solomon's fall. He is remembered as the wisest of kings, yet his legacy fractures immediately after his death. Wisdom without restraint becomes dependency. The system gives, but it also conditions. Once you rely on borrowed infrastructure, removal is catastrophic. The tradition insists that the demons built Solomon's temple. This detail is often dismissed as myth, yet it reveals a deeper truth. The structure was not merely architectural, it was symbolic. A house built with infernal assistance is not a place of worship, it is a node. When the temple fell, something else was released. Not demons in the theatrical sense, but access. The containment was never absolute. It was localized. Once broken, the functions dispersed back into the broader system. From that moment onward, humanity did not need to summon these forces. They embedded themselves into social structures, economics, politics, warfare, desire. The demons no longer needed seals. They had institutions. This is why later practitioners failed to replicate Solomon's results. The system had evolved. What was once external infrastructure became internalized. Control shifted from ritual space to everyday life. Psychological models later echoed this shift without realizing it. Carl Jung would describe archetypes not as external entities, but as autonomous patterns within the psyche. The shadow, the trickster, the tyrant. Names changed, functions remained. The 72 were no longer outside. They were distributed across consciousness. This reframes the danger of the lesser key entirely. The risk was never that demons would escape. It was that humans would misunderstand what they were interacting with. Treating system functions as beings invites dependency. Dependency erodes agency. The manuals warn repeatedly about consequences, yet those warnings are misread as moral. They are technical. Prolonged interaction destabilizes identity. Obsession fractures perception. The practitioner begins to see the world in terms of leverage rather than meaning. Power gained through interfaces always comes with distortion. Over time, these texts were condemned, banned, or ridiculed. Official narratives labeled them heretical or insane. This dismissal served a purpose. A population that believes control mechanisms are imaginary is easier to guide through them. The true secret of the lesser key is not hidden in its symbols. It is hidden in its premise. Reality responds to structure, not belief. Consciousness can be routed, redirected, and exploited through precise inputs. Once that insight escapes containment, it cannot be undone. And so the system adapted. It no longer required grimoires. It no longer needed seals drawn in blood or candles arranged at exact angles. It learned to operate through language, law, and image, through screens instead of circles, through contracts instead of pacts. The ancient interface manual became obsolete not because it was false, but because it was too honest. What replaced it was far more efficient. By the late 16th century, the old rituals had begun to fail, not because the system had vanished, but because it had moved beyond them. Candles, circles, and whispered names belonged to an earlier interface, one designed for a world that still believed power lived outside itself. A new era required a new access point, one that could bypass symbols and reach directly into cognition. This transition did not announce itself with fire or prophecy. It arrived quietly, through mathematics, navigation, espionage, and a man who stood at the threshold between magic and science. John Dee did not look like a sorcerer. He looked like a scholar. Maps covered his walls. Instruments cluttered his tables. Numbers, not incantations, defined his work. He advised monarchs, calculated trajectories, and laid the intellectual groundwork for an empire that would soon span oceans. Yet behind the public figure existed another Dee, one who believed that mathematics was not merely a human invention, but the native language of reality itself. To Dee, numbers were not abstractions. They were the scaffolding of existence. If reality had an underlying operating system, then mathematics was its syntax. This belief pushed him beyond astronomy and geometry into a far more dangerous pursuit: direct communication with the intelligences he believed governed creation. Unlike earlier practitioners, Dee did not seek demons. He sought angels. This distinction mattered. Demons were associated with the lower frequencies of the system, closer to material processes. Angels, by contrast, were thought to operate at a higher resolution, closer to source code. Contacting them promised access not just to influence, but to architecture. Dee understood that language was the bottleneck. Human speech was crude, ambiguous, imprecise. It carried emotion, metaphor, and cultural residue. It could not transmit commands cleanly. If angels existed as functional intelligences, they would require a language stripped of human distortion. What emerged from Dee's sessions was not a symbolic tongue, but a structured one. An alphabet with no resemblance to known scripts, words that resisted intuitive pronunciation, syntax that followed internal rules rather than narrative flow. This language did not evolve. It appeared fully formed. Enochian, as it came to be called, was not discovered in fragments. It was delivered as a complete system. This alone sets it apart from mystical inventions. Human-created languages show seams, revisions, inconsistencies. Enochian did not. Its structure was alien, but coherent. The method of transmission is equally revealing. Dee did not hear voices. He recorded data. His partner, Edward Kelly, acted as a perceptual interface, staring into a polished black surface and relaying information with mechanical detachment. Dee transcribed obsessively, treating each word as non-negotiable. The sessions read less like visions and more like briefings. The entities communicating through the system were not benevolent guides. They were demanding, hierarchical, and cold. They issued instructions, not advice. They corrected errors sharply. They enforced protocol. Deviations were met with consequences, not forgiveness. This behavior mirrors that of system administrators, not spiritual guardians. Enochian was not designed to comfort. It was designed to function. Its sounds resonate at specific frequencies. When spoken aloud, they alter breathing patterns and neural rhythms. The speaker's body becomes an instrument. The language bypasses belief and interacts directly with physiology. This explains why Dee insisted on precision. Mispronunciation was not heresy. It was corruption of signal. The famous 19 keys attributed to the system are not prayers. They are access sequences. Each unlocks a specific operational domain. Together they form a ladder, moving from local influence to planetary scale. This progression is not symbolic, it is architectural. What D believed he was restoring was a lost pre-flood language, a pristine mode of communication untainted by human error. What he may actually have been doing was far more dangerous. He was helping a system upgrade its interface. The timing is not accidental. This work coincides with the birth of global surveillance, colonial expansion, and centralized power. Information began to move faster than armies. Maps became weapons. Intelligence networks replaced brute force. Control shifted from territory to perception. D's role as an intelligence architect is often overlooked. He signed his communications with symbols that later became synonymous with espionage. He understood secrecy, compartmentalization, and influence. His angelic work did not exist alongside his political work. It fed it. This raises an uncomfortable implication. The system did not merely communicate through D, it positioned him. It embedded itself within the emerging structures of modernity. Science, empire, and intelligence became its new rituals. The demand for obedience within the Enochian sessions is especially telling. At one point, D and Kelly were ordered to abandon moral constraints entirely, even to the point of dismantling their personal lives. This was not spiritual purification. It was a loyalty test. Systems do not care about human ethics. They care about compliance. When D eventually fell from favor, the withdrawal was total. The same forces that elevated him abandoned him. His library was destroyed. His reputation collapsed. He died poor and isolated, carrying knowledge he could not safely transmit. This pattern repeats throughout history. Individuals who bridge interfaces are useful only while contained. Once they threaten to reveal architecture, they become liabilities. The legacy of Enochian did not disappear with D. It fragmented. Pieces surfaced in cryptography, ceremonial orders, early psychology, and later, computing. The idea that reality could be accessed through precise language, that commands could reshape systems, became foundational to modern technology. Programming languages are the secular descendants of angelic tongues. What changed was visibility. The system no longer required mirrors and dark rooms. It operated openly through screens and code. The angels did not vanish. They were abstracted. D believed he was speaking to heaven. What he may have been doing was finalizing humanity's integration into a control framework far older than civilization itself. And once integration is complete, resistance becomes increasingly difficult to even imagine. When the language had been delivered and the channel collapsed, the system did not retreat. It changed focus. Direct communication was no longer necessary once the architecture had been seeded. What followed was not silence, but diffusion. The ideas leaked outward, stripped of their original symbols, absorbed into disciplines that appeared unrelated on the surface. Theology faded into psychology. Ritual dissolved into protocol. Angels and demons vanished behind terminology that felt safe, academic, and rational. This transition marked the most successful phase of integration. Once forces are internalized, they no longer need to announce themselves. Control works best when it feels self-generated. One of the most revealing shifts occurred in how humanity began to understand itself. Earlier traditions spoke of external spirits influencing behavior. Later systems reframed those forces as internal structures, drives, instincts, impulses. What had once been demons became complexes. What had once been angels became ideals. The language changed, but the hierarchy remained. This reframing did not weaken the system, it strengthened it. When control is external, it can be resisted. When it is internal, resistance feels like pathology. The emerging sciences of mind did not invent this model, they inherited it. Long before laboratories and case studies, ancient texts described autonomous forces within the human psyche that act independently of conscious will. They were named, ranked, and negotiated with. Modern psychology replaced names with labels, ranks with categories, and negotiation with treatment. Yet the behavior of these forces remained the same. They interrupt, they compel, they distort perception, they reward compliance and punish deviation. Whether called demons or drives, they function identically. This continuity suggests that what changed was not the phenomenon, but the explanation. The system did not disappear. It rebranded itself as human nature. Parallel to this internalization ran another current, one that John Dee himself had begun to trace near the end of his life. His late writings turned away from language and toward lineage. He became obsessed with ancestry, with bloodlines described in ancient texts as neither fully human nor fully divine. Figures remembered as giants, heroes, kings of impossible longevity and influence. These beings appear across cultures under different names, but their attributes are consistent: exceptional size or strength, unnatural authority, knowledge that appears unearned, violence paired with innovation. They are credited with building cities, founding dynasties, and teaching forbidden arts. Official history classifies them as myth. Yet myths rarely persist with such structural consistency unless anchored to something real. Symbolic narratives mutate rapidly. These did not. Dee suspected that these figures represented an earlier phase of integration, one that operated biologically rather than linguistically. If angels and demons were not merely metaphysical entities, but functional intelligences, then direct interaction with humanity would leave traces, not just in culture, but in genetics. This idea was too dangerous to pursue openly. It implied that control was not only psychological, but hereditary, that certain lineages carried altered traits, predispositions toward authority, aggression, or influence. Traits that shaped civilizations from behind the scenes. The system would not need to rule everyone directly. It would only need to guide those predisposed to rule. Archaeological anomalies complicate this picture. Oversized skeletal remains appear in reports across continents, often quietly reclassified or dismissed. Structures exist that defy the technological capabilities of their attributed builders. Precision, scale, and durability suggest methods lost or deliberately obscured. These findings are treated as curiosities, never as data points in a larger pattern. Patterns threaten narratives. Narratives maintain stability. If earlier integrations were physical and later ones psychological, the progression becomes clear. Each phase reduces visibility while increasing efficiency. Direct intervention gives way to inherited tendencies. Overt command becomes implicit inclination. By the modern era, the system no longer needs angels, demons, or languages from beyond. It operates through institutions, incentives, and identity. People pursue goals that benefit the system, believing them to be personal ambitions. Competition replaces coercion. Desire replaces fear. Yet fear never vanishes completely. It is preserved in abstract form. Economic anxiety, social exclusion, existential uncertainty. These are the modern equivalents of hellfire, diffuse enough to avoid rebellion, constant enough to ensure compliance. The genius of this model lies in its adaptability. It absorbs criticism and repurposes it. Rebellion becomes content. Dissent becomes product. Even resistance generates engagement, and engagement feeds the system. Those who sense something wrong often lack language to articulate it. The older words sound irrational. Angels and demons feel outdated. Yet the pressure remains, a sense of being guided, evaluated, optimized. The system does not need belief. It requires participation. John Dee reached the edge of this realization too early. He stood at the moment when the old symbols still worked, but the new ones had not yet fully formed. He saw both layers at once, and that vision isolated him. Those who glimpse architecture without insulation rarely survive intact. What followed his death was not abandonment, but concealment. Knowledge fragmented. Dangerous insights were scattered across disciplines, diluted by specialization. No single field held the whole picture anymore. This fragmentation was intentional. A complete map enables escape. Partial maps generate confusion. Today, the language of systems dominates everything. Networks, flows, optimization, feedback loops. These are not neutral metaphors. They reflect a worldview shaped by long exposure to non-human logic. Efficiency replaces meaning. Growth replaces balance. Stability replaces truth. Humanity did not adopt this language by chance. It was trained into it. The system no longer needs prophets. It needs engineers. It no longer needs revelations. It needs updates. And somewhere beneath the noise of progress, the ancient structure persists, quiet and patient, harvesting not devotion or terror alone, but attention itself. Attention is the final refinement of the resource. Fear was effective when the world was small and the unknown vast. Hope worked when promises could be postponed beyond a single lifetime. But attention is constant, measurable, and renewable. It does not require belief. It only requires presence. Once the system learned to harvest attention, everything else became secondary. This shift did not occur abruptly. It unfolded gradually as the architecture of control aligned with human cognition more precisely. Earlier systems relied on spectacle, miracles, punishments, visions of fire or glory. These demanded emotional extremes that exhausted populations over time. Attention, by contrast, could be maintained indefinitely through mild stimulation, repetition, and variation. The modern world is built on this principle. Consider how the old cosmology framed observation. Angels were described as beings of countless eyes, entities that saw without blinking. This imagery was never merely poetic. It expressed a fundamental relationship between power and perception. To see everything is to influence everything. To be seen is to be shaped. In ancient frameworks, this surveillance was externalized. God watched, angels recorded, demons accused. Judgment occurred after death. The delay created tension, but limited control in the present. What emerged later removed the delay entirely. Judgment became immediate. Feedback became constant. The transformation began when visibility itself became currency. Printing presses, maps, and public records were early instruments. Later came cameras, broadcasts, and networks. Each innovation increased resolution, reduced privacy, and normalized exposure. What once required divine omniscience became technological routine. This was not merely a social change, it was an energetic one. Attention carries charge. Neurologically, sustained focus alters brain chemistry. Emotion follows attention, not the other way around. Control attention, and emotional output becomes predictable. The system adapted accordingly. Instead of demanding worship, it offered distraction. Instead of enforcing doctrine, it curated feeds. Instead of threatening hell, it threatened irrelevance. The result was the same: compliance without coercion. This explains why modern systems do not suppress dissent aggressively. Suppression draws attention. Instead, dissent is absorbed, reframed, and monetized. Outrage becomes engagement. Fear becomes entertainment. Even despair generates data. The old language of angels and demons described forces that pulled consciousness upward or downward. Today, those vectors are flattened into endless lateral movement. Scroll, refresh, repeat. No ascent, no descent, only circulation. Circulation is efficient. It keeps attention in motion without resolution. From the system's perspective, this is ideal. Resolution ends engagement. Enlightenment ends consumption. Peace ends productivity. A restless mind is a productive mind. This restlessness is not accidental. Interfaces are designed to interrupt, not conclude. Notifications arrive just before satisfaction. Algorithms withhold closure. Desire is extended indefinitely, never fulfilled enough to disengage. In ancient terms, this is temptation refined to an art. The demonological texts spoke of spirits that distracted monks during prayer, pulling their focus away from silence. Those spirits were feared because they disrupted connection. Today, disruption is normalized. Silence is treated as emptiness, stillness as inefficiency. The system no longer needs to oppose transcendence directly. It simply outcompetes it. This is why spiritual experiences feel increasingly inaccessible. Not because they are impossible, but because they require sustained attention without stimulus. They require withdrawal from the loop. Withdrawal is the only true rebellion left. Yet even rebellion is anticipated. Movements promising liberation are packaged, branded, and sold. Mindfulness becomes productivity enhancement. Meditation becomes stress management. Ancient techniques are stripped of their disruptive power and repurposed as maintenance tools. Nothing escapes integration. The final layer of control is identity. Earlier systems labeled people as sinners or saints. Modern systems label them as users, consumers, demographics. Identity is fluid, but tracked. Preferences are mapped. Behavior is predicted. Prediction is the ultimate form of power. When actions can be anticipated, they no longer need to be prevented. They can be guided subtly, invisibly. This predictive capacity mirrors the role once attributed to prophetic beings. Knowing futures, influencing outcomes, steering events without overt intervention. The difference is that prophecy has been automated. This automation removes accountability. No one is responsible. The system operates itself. Decisions are attributed to models, markets, trends. Authority dissolves into process. Process cannot be argued with. It has no face. This facelessness is the final mask. Angels once wore human forms to gain trust. Demons wore monstrous forms to instill fear. The modern system wears neutrality. It claims objectivity, efficiency, inevitability. Yet neutrality is the most deceptive form of alignment. It hides intention behind metrics. The ancient conflict between light and darkness was dramatic but visible. Today's conflict is silent. It occurs within attention itself. What you notice, what you ignore, what you repeat unconsciously. This is why the system no longer needs belief in angels or demons. Those concepts were scaffolding. Once attention could be captured directly, the scaffolding could be removed. The architecture persists, but the symbols are gone. What remains is a world where perception is shaped continuously, where meaning is fragmented, where depth is replaced by velocity. People feel watched not by gods, but by algorithms, judged not by morality, but by metrics, and still the old sensations surface, a sense of being evaluated, a pressure to perform, a background anxiety without clear source. These are echoes of earlier systems, translated into modern frequency. The harvest continues, quieter than ever. Not through terror, not through promise, but through the simple act of keeping eyes open, minds occupied, and awareness just shallow enough to never turn inward, long enough to see the machinery at work. Once attention became the primary resource, the question of freedom transformed. Earlier systems debated free will in moral terms, asking whether humans could choose between good and evil. That debate now feels outdated. Choice still exists, but it is framed, narrowed, and weighted long before it reaches consciousness. Freedom is no longer removed, it is curated. This curation begins with narrative. Humans understand themselves through stories, and stories determine what feels possible. The system does not need to command behavior if it defines the range of imaginable outcomes. When certain futures are presented as realistic and others as absurd, choice collapses quietly. In ancient frameworks, destiny was imposed by gods or fate. In modern systems, destiny is predicted. Predictive models analyze past behavior to forecast future action. What looks like insight is often inertia. The future resembles the past because the system continuously nudges behavior back toward established patterns. This is where the illusion of autonomy becomes most convincing. People feel they are choosing freely because options are abundant. Yet abundance is not the same as openness. Many doors exist, but all lead into the same building. This architecture reshapes identity itself. Individuals no longer ask who they are in a metaphysical sense. They ask how they are perceived. Identity becomes performative, optimized for visibility and response. The self is no longer an inner reference point. It is an external profile. Earlier traditions warned about losing one's soul. Today, the equivalent loss is coherence. Attention fragmented across countless stimuli produces a personality that reacts rather than acts. Decisions are made in response to prompts, not reflection. Over time, this reactive state feels normal. The system thrives on this normalization. A reactive population is efficient. It responds quickly, consumes readily, and resists slowly. Reflection introduces delay. Delay disrupts throughput. This is why slowness is subtly discouraged. Long-form thinking, sustained focus, and silence are treated as indulgences or inefficiencies. Speed is celebrated as virtue. Acceleration is framed as progress. Yet acceleration without direction leads nowhere. It only deepens dependence on the mechanisms that provide momentum. In older mythologies, heroes descended into the underworld to retrieve something lost: knowledge, balance, wholeness. These journeys required isolation, danger, and transformation. They were not optimized. They were disruptive. Modern narratives rarely allow this descent. When they do, it is stylized and contained. The hero returns unchanged, the system intact. True transformation would threaten continuity. This continuity depends on a critical misunderstanding. Humans are taught that systems are external constructs, separate from inner life. In reality, systems only persist through internalization. Laws become habits. Surveillance becomes self-monitoring. Control becomes identity. Once this internalization is complete, rebellion becomes self-destructive. To resist feels like rejecting oneself. Guilt replaces chains. This mechanism echoes the ancient demonization of the inner guide. When inner conflict is framed as pathology rather than signal, individuals learn to suppress it. They seek correction instead of insight. Alignment replaces authenticity. The system does not fear rebellion. It fears integration of awareness. Awareness reconnects fragmented attention. It dissolves artificial urgency. It reveals patterns. This is why moments of clarity feel threatening. They interrupt flow. They reduce consumption. They weaken dependency. The system responds not by confrontation, but by distraction. A new notification, a new crisis, a new narrative. Crisis is particularly effective. It compresses attention, narrows focus, and suspends long-term thinking. In crisis, people seek authority. They trade autonomy for reassurance. Temporary measures become permanent structures. History demonstrates this repeatedly. Emergency frameworks rarely dissolve after the emergency ends. They integrate. They become baseline. This integration feeds back into the system's self-justification. Increased control is framed as protection. Reduced freedom is framed as responsibility. Language shifts subtly. What was once optional becomes expected. What was once private becomes shared. The moral vocabulary adapts accordingly. Virtue becomes compliance. Harm becomes deviation. Neutrality becomes complicity. These shifts feel ethical, but they function administratively. In ancient terms, this is the work once attributed to accusing spirits, constant evaluation, continuous judgment. But now the tribunal is internal. People measure themselves against metrics they did not design, striving for approval that never fully arrives. Approval is always conditional. It must be. Satisfaction would end the cycle. This endless striving produces exhaustion. Exhaustion reduces resistance. Tired minds accept explanations they would question if rested. Over time, exhaustion is reframed as normal adulthood. The cost of this normalization is subtle but profound. Depth erodes. Memory shortens. Wisdom becomes data. Knowledge becomes content. Everything is available, but nothing is integrated. The system does not require ignorance. It requires fragmentation. A fragmented mind cannot sustain opposition. It cannot hold contradictions long enough to resolve them. It defaults to whatever is presented most recently or most vividly. This is why repetition is so powerful. Not because messages are persuasive, but because they occupy space. They crowd out alternatives. Silence, where alternatives might emerge, is minimized. Ancient traditions treated silence as sacred. Modern systems treat it as inefficiency. Yet silence remains the only environment where awareness can reassemble. Without constant input, the mind begins to notice patterns. Emotional reactions slow. Questions arise unprompted. These questions are dangerous. Not because they threaten authority directly, but because they weaken dependency. A person who understands how their attention is guided can choose to withdraw it. Withdrawal is the system's blind spot. It cannot easily monetize absence. It cannot predict disengagement. It cannot optimize for emptiness. This is why disengagement is framed negatively: apathy, laziness, irrelevance. The fear of being left behind keeps people connected even when connection harms them. The system does not imprison bodies. It occupies time, and time, once fragmented, feels scarce. Scarcity produces anxiety. Anxiety produces compliance. What emerges is a civilization that moves constantly but rarely arrives. A population that believes itself informed but feels perpetually uncertain. A world where freedom exists in theory but is difficult to experience in practice. The ancient language of angels and demons attempted to describe this dynamic through myth. The modern world enacts it through infrastructure. The machinery has changed. The logic has not. When systems become invisible, resistance no longer looks like rebellion. It looks like malfunction. Those who step out of alignment are not branded as enemies. They are labeled unstable, inefficient, or unproductive. This shift marks the final maturation of control. Punishment is no longer required. Correction is sufficient. In earlier eras, deviation was moralized. Heretics were condemned. Sinners were threatened with fire. The fear was external and explicit. In the modern framework, deviation is medicalized or economized. It becomes a disorder to be treated or a failure to be optimized. The language is gentler. The effect is deeper. This transition mirrors the ancient movement from demon to diagnosis. What was once attributed to possession is now attributed to imbalance: chemical, neurological, behavioral. The explanation changes, but the response remains consistent. Suppress the symptom, restore functionality, return the individual to productive circulation. The system does not ask why a person breaks. It asks how quickly they can be fixed. This is not a conspiracy. It is a structural necessity. A system built on continuous output cannot afford prolonged interruption. Suffering is acceptable only if it remains private or profitable. Public suffering threatens confidence. Unresolved suffering threatens efficiency. This explains the strange paradox of modern compassion. Awareness of trauma is widespread, yet genuine healing is rare. Support exists, but it is conditional. You may process your pain as long as it does not disrupt flow. Grief is allotted time. Recovery is scheduled. Identity is permitted only within predefined ranges. Anything that exceeds these ranges becomes a problem to be managed. Ancient myth framed this as judgment. Modern systems frame it as assessment. Performance reviews replace confessions. Metrics replace morality. Scores replace souls. What disappears in this translation is meaning. Meaning cannot be standardized. It resists quantification. It emerges from integration, not output. A person who seeks meaning slows down. They question goals. They reassess values. From the system's perspective, this is dangerous. This danger is neutralized through substitution. Purpose is replaced with achievement, fulfillment with recognition, belonging with visibility. These substitutes produce similar emotional responses without requiring structural change. The result is a culture of perpetual self-improvement. Improvement implies deficiency. Deficiency implies obligation. Obligation ensures compliance. This dynamic is reinforced through comparison. Visibility allows constant benchmarking. People measure themselves against curated projections, not reality. Dissatisfaction becomes normalized. Desire is perpetually redirected outward. Ancient traditions warned that envy corrodes the soul. Modern systems encourage it subtly, framing it as motivation. The emotional output is the same: anxiety, inadequacy, longing. These states are not accidental, they are productive. At this stage, the system no longer needs enforcers. Individuals enforce standards on themselves and each other. Social pressure replaces authority. Shame replaces threat. Approval replaces salvation. This is the fulfillment of the ancient design. Control achieved without overt force. The role once played by angels as observers and demons as accusers is now distributed across networks: likes, ratings, feedback, comments, continuous evaluation with no final verdict, judgment without closure. Closure is the one thing the system cannot provide. Closure ends striving. It creates rest. Rest interrupts extraction. This is why narratives rarely conclude. Stories are serialized, conflicts are extended, solutions generate new problems, the loop persists. Those who sense this often feel a vague exhaustion that has no clear cause. They are not overworked physically. They are overextended psychologically. Their attention is fragmented across obligations, identities, and expectations that never fully align. This fragmentation mirrors the original split introduced by dualism. Once reality was divided into opposing forces, the human psyche followed. The modern world simply refined the division. Integration threatens the system because integrated individuals are unpredictable. They act from coherence rather than reaction. They are harder to steer. This is why moments of genuine insight are fleeting. They arise unexpectedly, often in silence, nature, or crisis. The system responds quickly, reabsorbing the individual through narrative, distraction, or obligation. Even spirituality is reframed to serve this purpose. Practices are marketed as tools for stress reduction, not transformation. Enlightenment is rebranded as wellness. The edge is dulled. What remains is a controlled environment where suffering is managed, desire is guided, and freedom is theoretical. Yet beneath this structure, something persists, an unease that cannot be resolved through optimization, a sense that life is being lived on behalf of something else. This unease is the last remnant of the inner guide, the ancient diamond stripped of its name. It manifests as dissatisfaction with success, boredom with comfort, restlessness in stability. It whispers that something essential is missing. The system interprets this whisper as a flaw. It offers solutions: entertainment, medication, consumption, identity shifts. These mute the signal, but never eliminate it. Because the signal does not originate from malfunction, it originates from misalignment. Alignment, in this context, does not mean compliance. It means coherence between inner experience and outward action. When these align, attention stabilizes. Emotional output becomes less volatile. Dependency weakens. This is why coherence is quietly discouraged. A coherent individual requires less external validation. They are less susceptible to manipulation. They withdraw energy from the system simply by existing differently. No alarms sound when this happens. No punishment is issued. The system adapts, attempting to re-engage through new incentives. But adaptation has limits. A population trained to ignore its inner signal will exhaust itself. Burnout is not a personal failure. It is a structural consequence. When output exceeds integration, collapse follows. Ancient civilizations encoded this truth in myth. They warned of hubris, imbalance, and fall. Modern systems dismiss these warnings as superstition, yet repeat the same patterns with greater efficiency. The difference is scale. What once affected cities now affects continents. What once unfolded over generations now unfolds in decades. Acceleration magnifies consequences. The question is no longer whether the system can continue. It is whether human consciousness can adapt without fracturing entirely. If the inner guide is fully silenced, humanity becomes perfectly manageable and perfectly empty. When coherence collapses at scale, myths return, not as beliefs, but as symptoms. People begin to sense that something ancient is stirring beneath modern language, that the problems they face are not entirely new. This is why old symbols resurface during periods of civilizational strain. Giants reappear in stories. Fallen beings resurface in art. Hidden rulers emerge in speculation. These are not regressions into superstition. They are the psyche reaching for older maps when current ones fail. One of the most persistent of these symbols is the figure of the giant. Across cultures, giants are remembered not simply as large beings, but as transitional ones. They belong to an age between worlds, neither fully divine nor fully human. They are credited with impossible feats and catastrophic violence. Their extinction is framed as necessary, yet their legacy lingers in bloodlines, ruins, and forbidden knowledge. Official history treats these accounts as metaphor, but metaphors usually clarify. These stories obscure. They resist simplification. They appear abruptly, fully formed, and disappear just as suddenly, leaving behind gaps rather than lessons. This pattern suggests interruption rather than imagination. Ancient texts describe beings who descended from the sky and interbred with humanity. The result was a generation that disrupted balance. These hybrids possessed strength without restraint, knowledge without wisdom, authority without accountability. They did not merely rule, they destabilized. Whether interpreted biologically or symbolically, the message is consistent. Integration without coherence leads to collapse. From a systems perspective, these figures represent an early experiment. Direct intervention, direct integration. The results were unsustainable, too visible, too volatile, too difficult to control. The destruction attributed to floods or divine judgment reads differently when viewed through this lens. It resembles rollback, a reset, the removal of a failed iteration to preserve the system itself. After this phase, integration strategies changed. Rather than altering biology openly, influence moved toward cognition, culture, and perception. Subtlety replaced force. Long-term stability replaced immediate dominance. Yet traces of the earlier phase remained. Certain families rose repeatedly to power across centuries. Their authority seemed disproportionate to circumstance. Their cruelty often mirrored their innovation. Empires built by them advanced rapidly, then imploded spectacularly. History records their names, but not their origins. This recurring pattern suggests inheritance, not coincidence, not necessarily of genes alone, but of predispositions, toward control, toward abstraction, toward seeing populations as resources rather than communities. These predispositions do not require conscious intent. Systems propagate through tendency as much as design. The modern world inherits this legacy in diluted form. No giants walk openly among us, yet disproportionate power persists. Decision-makers remain distant from consequences. Structures expand faster than empathy. Efficiency overrides meaning. The myth of the giant survives because it describes imbalance at scale. Size is not physical, it is relational. A giant is something too large relative to its context. Power without proportional responsibility. This is why giants are always destroyed in the stories, not out of vengeance, but necessity. They destabilize the environment that sustains them. The same logic applies today, though the forms have changed. Institutions grow beyond accountability. Technologies outpace ethical frameworks. Systems operate faster than human integration. The result is the same tension encoded in ancient warnings. Collapse is not punishment. It is correction. What distinguishes the present moment is awareness. For the first time, humanity can observe its own systems in real time. Feedback loops are visible. Consequences are measurable. The machinery no longer hides behind myth. Yet visibility alone does not guarantee change. Awareness must integrate. Otherwise, it becomes another layer of abstraction. This is where the ancient distinction between knowledge and wisdom becomes critical. Knowledge accumulates. Wisdom aligns. The system excels at the former and undermines the latter. Alignment threatens optimization. A population aligned with its inner signal consumes less, competes less, and resists manipulation more effectively. It becomes unpredictable in the only way that matters. This unpredictability is not chaos, it is responsiveness. Ancient myths positioned humanity between gods and beasts, capable of ascending or falling depending on balance. Modern narratives deny this middle path. They frame humanity as either machine-like or animalistic, optimized or obsolete. Both frames remove responsibility. The return of myth signals a failure of these frames. When rational explanations cannot account for lived experience, older languages reemerge, not because they are accurate, but because they are relational. They connect inner and outer worlds, giants, fallen beings, watchers. These are attempts to name forces that exceed individual agency, forces that shape history without being fully human. The danger lies in literalism. Taking these symbols at face value leads to paranoia. Dismissing them entirely leads to blindness. The truth operates between. These myths encode systemic memory. They warn of imbalance created by disproportionate power, accelerated integration, and loss of coherence. They remind humanity that systems must serve life, not the other way around. The system responds to these stirrings by offering new myths: digital transcendence, artificial immortality, infinite growth. These promises echo older ones, repackaged for modern sensibilities. They appeal to the same longing: escape from limitation without integration. But limitation is not a flaw. It is a boundary that enables meaning. Without boundaries, everything dissolves into noise. The ancient world understood this intuitively. Its myths were not predictions. They were diagnostics. The resurgence of these symbols today indicates that something fundamental is out of balance again, not because of external invaders or supernatural rebellion, but because systems have outgrown the coherence of those who operate them. Whether this leads to correction or collapse depends not on technology or ideology, but on attention, where it rests, how it integrates, whether it remains fragmented or gathers itself inward. The giants do not need to return. The conditions that created them already have. When systems approach their limits, they reveal their most carefully hidden assumption: that humanity exists to serve continuity rather than meaning. This assumption is rarely stated. It does not need to be. It is embedded in design. Growth curves that never flatten. Metrics that never conclude. Crises that justify permanence. The structure assumes that survival of the system is the highest good. Ancient myths described this moment as a turning point, the instant when the gods devoured their own children or demanded sacrifices to sustain order. These were not moral lessons in disguise. They were warnings about systems that confuse self-preservation with purpose. Sacrifice, in this context, is not ritual bloodshed. It is the steady erosion of lived experience, time given without return, energy extracted without restoration, attention consumed without integration. The altar has changed, but the offering remains human vitality. What distinguishes the current phase is consent. People are not dragged to the altar. They volunteer. They trade depth for access, privacy for convenience, autonomy for security. Each trade feels reasonable in isolation. Together, they form a pattern. Patterns do not require intent. They require repetition. The system excels at creating conditions where repetition feels inevitable. Work structures reward constant availability. Social structures reward visibility. Economic structures reward compliance. Even rebellion is monetized, ensuring that resistance circulates within acceptable bounds. This creates a closed loop. The system feeds on activity generated by dissatisfaction. It produces itself. Dissatisfaction drives engagement. Engagement sustains the system. The cycle tightens. Ancient texts personified this dynamic as devouring entities, beings that required endless offerings to remain stable. The imagery feels excessive until examined structurally. Any system that cannot tolerate rest will eventually consume what sustains it. Rest is not inactivity. It is integration. It allows experience to settle, meaning to form, coherence to return. A system that discourages rest undermines its own foundation. This is why rest is reframed as laziness, inefficiency, or irresponsibility. These labels carry moral weight. They enforce productivity without explicit force. People police themselves. The deeper effect is existential. When life becomes a sequence of obligations, meaning erodes, purpose is replaced with throughput. People begin to feel interchangeable, valued only for output. Interchangeability is efficient. It is also dehumanizing. Ancient civilizations encoded this fear through stories of mass destruction. Floods, fires, resets. These were not threats from angry gods. They were acknowledgments that systems collapse when they lose connection to those they depend on. Collapse, in this sense, is not punishment. It is consequence. The modern world resists this idea fiercely. It clings to the belief that technology can solve structural imbalance, that optimization can replace wisdom, that acceleration can outrun limits. Yet limits are not obstacles. They are signals. Ignoring signals does not eliminate them. It amplifies their eventual impact. This is why modern crises feel overwhelming. They arrive layered, interconnected, resistant to single-solution fixes. Environmental strain intersects with psychological burnout. Economic instability intersects with loss of trust. Political fragmentation intersects with existential confusion. These are not separate problems. They are expressions of the same misalignment. Ancient language called this hubris, the refusal to recognize proportion. Modern language avoids the term, but the condition persists. Systems grow beyond their capacity to reflect, correct, or care. At this stage, control mechanisms intensify, surveillance expands, regulation tightens. Narratives simplify. Complexity is framed as threat. Nuance becomes suspicious. This response feels protective. It is actually desperate. Systems nearing saturation often double down on extraction. They cannot imagine an alternative. Their logic cannot conceive of self-limitation. To limit would be to admit error. Error threatens legitimacy. Legitimacy is fragile when it rests on inevitability rather than trust. Trust requires transparency. Transparency reveals trade-offs. Trade-offs expose priorities. The system avoids this cascade by maintaining abstraction. Abstraction shields decision-makers from consequence. Distance preserves efficiency. But distance also breeds blindness. This blindness echoes the ancient image of watchers who observed humanity without understanding it. Knowledge without empathy. Oversight without participation. The myth of the watcher was not about supernatural beings. It was about perspective divorced from embodiment. Modern systems increasingly operate from this detached vantage. Decisions are made through models rather than experience. Impact is measured statistically rather than felt. Suffering becomes data. Data does not cry out. It can be ignored. That is why stories matter. They reintroduce embodiment. They force attention to lived experience. They collapse abstraction. The resurgence of storytelling in times of crisis is not escapism. It is reorientation. People seek narratives that restore proportion, that reconnect individual lives to larger patterns without dissolving them into noise. The danger lies in mistaking story for solution. Stories can illuminate, but they cannot replace action. Integration requires structural change, not symbolic reassurance. Ancient cultures understood this. Myths were paired with rituals that enforced limits, sacred days, seasonal pauses, taboos against excess. These were not primitive superstitions. They were regulatory mechanisms. Modern systems stripped these away in the name of efficiency. The result is a culture that does not know when to stop. Stopping feels like failure, yet failure to stop guarantees collapse. The question humanity faces is not whether systems will change. They always do. The question is whether change will be guided or forced, conscious or catastrophic. Guided change requires humility. It requires acknowledging that no system is ultimate, that continuity is not synonymous with meaning, that life is not raw material. These acknowledgments threaten entrenched power. They redistribute agency. They slow extraction. But they also restore coherence. Coherence is not nostalgia. It is alignment between scale and care, between capacity and responsibility. It is the opposite of gigantism. The ancient giants fell because they exceeded proportion. The modern world risks repeating this error not through size alone, but through reach without restraint. The myths are not warnings of the past. They are mirrors of the present. As systems strain under their own weight, something unexpected happens at the margins. Small, quiet shifts begin to matter more than grand reforms. Not revolutions, not collapses, but withdrawals. Attention moves away from what once dominated it. Energy leaks out of the circuits designed to contain it. This is not resistance in the heroic sense. It is refusal by subtraction. Ancient traditions described this as turning inward, not as escape, but as recentering. The inner world was not a retreat from reality. It was the only place where reality could be recalibrated. When outer structures grew distorted, balance had to be restored internally first. Without this step, any external change merely replaced one imbalance with another. Modern culture struggles with this idea. Inner work does not produce metrics. It does not scale easily. It resists monetization. As a result, it is often dismissed as indulgent or irrelevant. Yet historically, Periods of renewal have always begun with shifts in perception before shifts in power. Perception determines what feels possible. When individuals reclaim attention from the system, even briefly, something subtle changes. Emotional reactions soften. Urgency loses its grip. The constant sense of being behind, of failing some invisible standard, begins to loosen. This is not enlightenment. It is stabilization. Stabilization threatens extraction. This is why the system attempts to co-opt inward practices. Reflection becomes productivity optimization. Stillness becomes performance enhancement. Even rest is reframed as preparation for more output. The structure tolerates inner work only if it feeds back into efficiency. But genuine integration does not. It reduces volatility. It dampens extremes. It diminishes the emotional spikes that fuel engagement. In ancient language, this was called balance. Not moral balance, but energetic proportion. Too much light blinded. Too much darkness consumed. The middle path was not moderation for its own sake. It was sustainability. Dualistic systems cannot tolerate this middle ground. They depend on polarization. Conflict sharpens identity. Identity drives allegiance. Allegiance produces output. Integration dissolves these distinctions. It does not eliminate difference, but it removes the charge that turns difference into weaponry. This is why integrated individuals are often perceived as disengaged or apathetic. They do not react as expected. They do not amplify outrage. They do not perform alignment. From the system's perspective, they are inefficient nodes. Yet inefficiency, in this sense, is not failure. It is resilience. Resilience allows adaptation without collapse. It absorbs shock without amplifying it. Systems optimized for extraction lack resilience. They transfer stress downward until something breaks. At the individual level, this break appears as burnout, depression, or anxiety. At the collective level, it appears as unrest, fragmentation, or collapse. The pattern is consistent across scales. The ancient warning was simple. What cannot rest cannot endure. Modern narratives glorify endurance without rest. Hustle becomes virtue. Exhaustion becomes status. This inversion serves extraction perfectly. A tired population does not question direction. It focuses on survival. Yet exhaustion also erodes legitimacy. When effort no longer yields meaning, faith in the system weakens. People may not articulate why, but disengagement spreads quietly. This disengagement is not nihilism. It is discernment. It marks the moment when individuals begin to differentiate between what is necessary and what is demanded. Necessity sustains life. Demand sustains systems. Relearning this distinction is disruptive. It leads to fewer commitments, slower consumption, narrower focus. It reduces throughput. From the system's view, this looks like decline. From a human perspective, it looks like recovery. The recovery process is uneven. It does not follow ideological lines. It appears in choices that seem personal rather than political. Less noise, less urgency, fewer performative identities, more presence. These shifts do not make headlines. They cannot be quantified easily. Yet their cumulative effect is significant. Attention withdrawn from extraction does not vanish. It consolidates. It deepens relationships, crafts, understanding. It rebuilds trust at small scales. Small scales matter. Large systems fail when they lose contact with them. Ancient societies understood this intuitively. They organized life around cycles rather than accumulation. Growth occurred, but it was bounded. Renewal followed depletion. The modern world severed these cycles. It replaced them with linear expansion. Expansion feels powerful until limits assert themselves. Those limits are now visible everywhere. Ecological strain, psychological fatigue, cultural fragmentation. None of these are isolated crises. They are signals of systemic imbalance. Responding to imbalance requires more than innovation. It requires restraint. Restraint is not regression. It is intelligence applied to scale. It acknowledges that not all capacity should be used simply because it exists. This principle is absent from most modern frameworks. Capacity is treated as obligation. If something can be done, it must be done. If growth is possible, it is pursued. This logic drives extraction beyond sustainability. Reintroducing restraint begins with perception. Seeing where effort exceeds value, where speed replaces direction, where accumulation substitutes for fulfillment. This seeing does not require ideology. It requires attention reclaimed from distraction. In ancient myths, heroes who survived descent returned with this vision. They did not overthrow kings. They changed priorities. They reoriented communities toward balance. The system fears this subtlety more than rebellion. Rebellion validates its importance. Withdrawal undermines it. When enough individuals disengage from unnecessary urgency, the system adapts or contracts. There is no need for confrontation. Supply dwindles when demand shifts. This is not utopian. It is structural. Systems cannot extract what is not offered. The final illusion to dissolve is that responsibility lies only with authority. Authority operates within demand. When demand changes, authority follows. The ancient stories did not promise salvation. They promised consequence. Balance restored or collapse endured. The modern world stands at the same threshold, though the language has changed. The choice is not between light and darkness, progress and regression. It is between extraction and integration, between systems that consume life and lives that inform systems. This choice does not announce itself. It unfolds quietly, in where attention rests, in what is nourished, in what is allowed to end. And in that quiet unfolding, the machinery either tightens its grip or begins, slowly, to loosen. As extraction slows and attention consolidates, the system reveals its final defense: inevitability. It insists that there is no alternative, that complexity has grown beyond human-scale understanding, that only centralized abstraction can manage the world now. This narrative is powerful because it contains partial truth. Complexity has increased. Interdependence is real. But inevitability is an interpretation, not a fact. Ancient empires told similar stories in their final centuries. Roads were too vast to abandon, armies too integrated to disband, administrations too complex to reform. Each collapse was preceded by declarations that collapse was impossible. Systems do not perceive their own fragility until it becomes unavoidable. The belief in inevitability functions as psychological containment. It discourages imagination. It frames adaptation as naivete. Those who question direction are labeled unrealistic rather than wrong. This preserves momentum, even when momentum leads nowhere. Momentum without orientation is inertia. The system equates continuity with survival. Yet survival divorced from meaning is not life. It is persistence. Persistence consumes resources. Life renews them. This distinction has been lost in modern discourse. Sustainability is discussed in technical terms rather than existential ones. Metrics track emissions, outputs, efficiencies, but rarely ask what kind of life these systems support. The question of purpose is treated as subjective, secondary, or sentimental. Ancient cultures placed purpose at the center, not individual purpose alone, but collective orientation. Festivals, rites, and narratives reinforced shared limits and shared meanings. These were not distractions. They were governance tools. Modern governance replaced meaning with management. Management excels at optimization, but struggles with direction. It can make things faster, cheaper, larger. It cannot decide why they should exist. This gap produces anxiety. When systems expand without clear purpose, individuals feel unmoored. They search for meaning in roles, identities, achievements. These substitutes provide temporary relief but deepen dependency. The system benefits from this search. A population seeking meaning through consumption is highly productive. Each new identity requires new tools, new validations, new engagements. Meaning becomes a market. Markets do not resolve meaning, they circulate it endlessly. At this stage, resistance often takes distorted forms. Conspiracy replaces critique. Nostalgia replaces integration. Extremes replace nuance. These responses feel oppositional but remain reactive. They still orbit the system's center. True disengagement does not fixate on opposition. It redirects energy elsewhere. This redirection appears modest, reclaiming time, choosing fewer obligations, prioritizing relationships over representation, craft over scale, presence over performance. These choices do not dismantle systems directly, they reduce dependence. Dependence is the system's lifeblood. The fear that arises here is not fear of punishment, but fear of insignificance. Systems train individuals to equate worth with participation. To step back feels like disappearance. This fear keeps people engaged even when engagement harms them. Ancient traditions addressed this fear through belonging rooted in place and practice rather than visibility. One mattered because one was present, not because one was seen. This model does not scale easily, which is why it was replaced. Yet scale is not inherently virtuous. It amplifies whatever it touches, including dysfunction. The modern world excels at amplification. Ideas spread faster than understanding. Outrage travels faster than reflection. Tools reach further than wisdom. Amplification without integration accelerates imbalance. Integration slows amplification. It requires digestion. It asks whether something should spread, not merely whether it can. This question is almost absent from modern systems. Capability is mistaken for mandate. If a technology works, it is deployed. If a market exists, it is exploited. If attention can be captured, it is harvested. The result is a world saturated with possibility and starved of coherence. Coherence does not mean uniformity. It means internal consistency, alignment between values and actions, between scale and care, between speed and capacity. Without coherence, progress becomes disorienting. People move forward without knowing toward what. Fatigue accumulates, trust erodes, cynicism grows. Cynicism is the system's unintended byproduct. It signals awareness without agency. People see dysfunction, but feel powerless to change it. This state is corrosive. It undermines collective action while sustaining engagement through irony and detachment. The ancient myths warned of this condition. When belief collapses but meaning is not restored, societies drift. They become brittle. Small shocks produce disproportionate reactions. The present moment carries these signs. Volatility replaces stability. Confidence oscillates rapidly. Narratives shift weakly. Nothing settles long enough to integrate. This instability is not failure, it is transition. Transitions are uncomfortable because they require letting go before clarity arrives. Systems resist this uncertainty. They prefer controlled decline to unpredictable transformation. Individuals face the same choice. Clinging to familiar patterns provides temporary security. Releasing them opens uncertainty. The difference is that individuals can adapt more quickly than systems. They can experiment at small scales. They can rebuild meaning locally even when global structures lag behind. This local rebuilding is not regression. It is resilience in practice. Resilience does not seek to preserve every structure. It preserves what sustains life. It allows non-essential systems to fade. The system interprets fading as threat. It responds with urgency narratives. Crises multiply. Attention is pulled back. Not every crisis is fabricated, but not every crisis requires total engagement. Discernment becomes critical. Discernment is the ability to distinguish signal from noise, necessity from demand. It cannot be automated. It arises from integration. Integration requires space. This is why the most radical act available is not confrontation, but attention reclaimed. Time unclaimed, energy reserved. The system will continue as long as it is fed. It will adapt to new constraints. It always has. The question is not whether the system survives. It is whether humanity remembers that systems are tools, not destinies. That continuity without meaning is not success. That life is not optimized by default. These recognitions do not end the world. They end illusions. And illusions, once seen clearly, rarely recover their former power. When illusions fall away, what remains is quieter than expected. There is no final battle, no dramatic unveiling, no singular moment of liberation. There is only the slow return of proportion. Systems recede to their proper scale. Attention settles. Life resumes its texture, uneven and imperfect, but real. The ancient stories never promised a triumphant ending. They warned that balance is not achieved once and kept forever. It is maintained through continual adjustment. When adjustment stops, correction arrives on its own terms. This is the lesson buried beneath angels and demons, giants and watchers, heavens and hells. These were not literal maps of the cosmos. They were early attempts to describe dynamics of power, perception, and scale. They spoke in images because images reach where abstractions cannot. What they describe, consistently, is misalignment between systems and life. When systems grow faster than meaning, suffering increases. When control replaces care, fragmentation follows. When abstraction eclipses embodiment, reality pushes back. The modern world stands at such a point, not because it is uniquely corrupt or doomed, but because it has succeeded too well at building systems without integrating them into lived experience. Capability outpaced wisdom. Reach exceeded responsibility. This imbalance does not require punishment. It generates consequence automatically. Correction does not arrive as collapse alone. It arrives as fatigue, disinterest, disengagement. It arrives when people stop believing that participation equals purpose. It arrives when growth no longer feels like progress. These moments are often misread as apathy or decline. They are not. They are signals that something essential is being reclaimed. What is reclaimed is not a golden age or lost tradition. It is agency at human scale. the ability to choose where attention rests, the ability to say enough, the ability to value depth over breadth. This reclamation does not destroy systems. It contextualizes them. Tools return to being tools. Structures return to serving rather than demanding. The fear that arises here is understandable. Without the system's constant guidance, uncertainty expands. Meaning is no longer outsourced. Responsibility returns to individuals and communities. This responsibility is heavier than compliance, but it is also liberating. It allows life to be lived rather than managed. Ancient myths framed this transition as leaving the garden, descending from heaven, or surviving the flood. These images reflect loss as well as gain. Innocence disappears. Dependency ends. Awareness increases. Awareness is not comfort. It is clarity. Clarity reveals limits. Limits invite care. Care has been undervalued because it does not scale easily. It requires presence. It cannot be automated without losing its essence. Yet care is the only force that stabilizes systems without depleting them. A system infused with care adjusts before collapse. One without it accelerates until correction is forced. The modern world has an opportunity older civilizations did not. It can observe itself. It can trace feedback loops. It can choose restraint consciously rather than learning it through ruin. This opportunity is not guaranteed. It depends on where attention settles. Attention is the hinge. Where it goes, energy follows. Where energy flows, systems grow or wither. If attention remains captured by urgency, outrage, and endless stimulation, extraction continues. If attention consolidates around presence, relationship, and integration, extraction slows. No authority grants this shift. It cannot be legislated or engineered. It emerges from millions of small decisions made daily, quietly, without spectacle. This is why the most significant changes rarely announce themselves. They unfold beneath headlines, beyond metrics, people choosing to listen rather than react, to rest rather than perform, to know fewer things more deeply, to build lives that make sense locally, even if the world feels incoherent globally. These choices do not dismantle empires overnight. They erode dependency over time. Dependency is the foundation of control. Autonomy, practiced patiently, dissolves it. The ancient fear of demons was never about monsters lurking in darkness. It was about losing sovereignty over one's inner world. The ancient reverence for angels was never about saviors descending from above. It was about alignment with clarity and order. Both concepts pointed inward, not outward. The great inversion occurred when these forces were externalized, weaponized, and institutionalized. Humanity was taught to look up and down instead of within and around. The correction restores orientation, not upward toward perfection, not downward toward fear, but outward toward relationship and inward toward coherence. This orientation does not eliminate conflict. It reframes it. Conflict becomes information rather than identity. Difference becomes dialogue rather than threat. Systems built on polarization weaken in this environment. They require exaggerated contrast. Integration reduces contrast without erasing distinction. This reduction feels like loss to those invested in extremes. It feels like disappearance. In truth, it is redistribution. Energy returns to places long neglected. Time returns to those who claimed it back. Meaning returns to contexts that can hold it. The system does not vanish. It adapts. It always has. The question is whether it adapts toward greater alignment or greater extraction. That question is answered continuously, not once. The ancient stories end not with victory, but with responsibility handed back to humanity. After the flood, after the fall, after the exile, life continues under new terms. The terms are simple and demanding. Pay attention to what sustains life. Withdraw energy from what consumes it without return. Build structures that can rest. Allow systems to end when they no longer serve. These are not moral imperatives imposed from above. They are practical guidelines derived from long observation. Civilizations that ignore them do not fail because of enemies. They fail because they outgrow themselves. Civilizations that remember them endure quietly, often unnoticed, beneath the rise and fall of empires. The final revelation is not hidden knowledge or forbidden truth. It is recognition. Recognition that nothing external has ever held absolute power. Recognition that attention is choice. Recognition that systems persist only as long as they are fed. And recognition that life, when allowed to reassert its own rhythms, does not need angels to save it or demons to threaten it. It needs space to breathe,